Did a government raid on an FLDS polygamist church back in 1953 improve things, or did it make them worse? 60 years later, investigators stormed another polygamous compound in Texas, and I think it created the beginning of the end, especially for the FLDS self-proclaimed prophet, Rulon Jeffs. Well, hello everybody, and welcome to Fundamentalist Fridays here on Profiling Evil. Now, this is episode 8 of what I think is going to be 12 episodes in our exploration of the FLDS communities of Hildale, Utah, and Colorado City, Arizona. You might still hear an old-timer calling the area Short Creek. You know, back when I first started coming out here as an investigator for the Attorney General, everybody I passed along these mostly dirt streets were members of the FLDS Fundamentalist Church. Their signature clothing of those long sleeve shirts for the men and prairie dresses for the women was commonplace. Never would you have seen anybody walking around in a short sleeve shirt, and more importantly, you'd never see them wearing shorts. If they did, it would mean immediate expulsion from the community and the cult. But not anymore. The community is rapidly changing, and I think it's for some parts for the better, and in some cases, worse. Well, I want to start today's video at the historic schoolhouse on the Colorado City, Arizona side of that communal split between the state of Arizona and Utah on the state line. The school is an iconic backdrop to an event that solidified the government mistrust that still sits inside the hearts of the FLDS followers. In my opinion, it was the single most significant event that made my job of investigating claims of abuse in the polygamous community much more difficult. I also think it set the stage for apocalyptic claims that the world was going to end in 2000. It solidified the polygamous community's need to band together to protect their way of life, including preparing to defend themselves if they needed to. So I want to start off by taking you back in time to the pre-dawn hours of July 26, 1953. Police officers and National Guardsmen were stationed outside this little community known as Short Creek. The officers had traveled rather discreetly, or at least so they thought, throughout the night in small teams. It wasn't the first time that Arizona officials had converged on the community. In fact, in 1935 and in 1944, Arizona cops, along with agents from the FBI, devised a plan to take advantage of an act. It was called the Mann Act, a law that prohibited human trafficking. Mann Act, M-A-N-N Act. Once called the White Slave Trafficking Act of 1910, the Mann Act law made it a felony to engage in interstate or foreign commerce with the idea of transporting any woman or girl for the purpose of prostitution or debauchery or for any other immoral purpose. Now, the act was created to prevent prostitution and human trafficking, but the ambiguous language of the act about immorality resulted in it being used to criminalize even consensual sexual behavior between adults, namely polygamy. The arrests in 1935 and in 1944 weren't very successful, and things in the tiny polygamous town returned to normal after those events. Now, this might have infuriated some government officials who continued to look for ways to end the plural marriage practice. By 1950, things started reaching another boiling point in Arizona as caseworkers, welfare workers, started reporting the young polygamous wives, some that were as young as 13 or 14 years old, can you imagine, were applying for public assistance. And in more than just a few instances, these young brides were listing the same man as their husband. The concerns eventually reached the desk of Arizona Governor Howard Pyle, and he in turn reached the Attorney General, Fred Wilson. Angered by the continued practice of polygamy, they approached Utah and asked Utah to help them remove all of the polygamists and move them to a barracks in Kingman, Arizona, where they'd be processed and moved the children to foster care, the adults to prison, breaking up the families. Well, the state of Utah declined the offer to join them in this action. I'm not exactly sure, but frankly, I'm kind of glad they did. You know, it took 3 years for Governor Wilson to get the Arizona State Legislature to support the action, but finally, lawmakers gave him about $50,000 to rescue Short Creek's women and children from the shackles of polygamy. Now, the state hired a private detective firm to map out the community, to uncover key violators, and draft a raid plan that was in place and activated by July 25th. Now, keep in mind, I am not against going after and arresting men who have child brides. This thing was really interesting, though, because with their plan in place, the state assigned an army of more than 100 police officers, backed by National Guardsmen, to travel for a weekend traffic control training assignment. The officers were completely unaware that they were going to be participating in a raid on the polygamous community. Now, this was done in secrecy to maintain secrecy. They didn't want the polygamists to know they were coming. And I completely get this need for silence. In fact, that's exactly what we did in the Zion Society case. We didn't allow the officers who were going to participate in the raid to even know what was going on because of fear that somehow the people we were going after would be tipped off. So I understand why they did that. Well, once these officers were briefed on the raid, they started their 4-hour drive to Short Creek, leaving in more than 100 different patrol cars, spaced about 5 minutes apart. Those coming from Arizona made their way up from the east, and others went around and came in from the west, going through Utah and into the community. But the polygamous community leaders had already received the tip that the raid was about to happen, and they went out and placed sentries throughout the valley whose charge was to notify the FLDS people if the raid truly was going to happen. They determined that the only way they could broadcast this raid coming, they didn't really have radios and things like that they could use back then. They decided that the most effective way to broadcast that these police officers were coming was to detonate dynamite near the convoy. Now, I don't know about you, but this was really troubling to me that these people who suggest they were so peaceful were prepared to light off sticks of dynamite, put sticks of dynamite in the hands of young boys, and give them the charge of notifying the rest of the community of an attack or a raid happening. To me, it was really something that there weren't fatalities as a result of that. But I want to take a moment and listen to one of those boys, now a man, who was assigned to the task of igniting dynamite as the alarm of the impending raid. His name is Merrill Jessup, and this is a conversation that he had that someone recorded many years later. Let's listen in.
It was interesting, as been reported, about the eclipse showing up. And the thing was delayed a little while, and the people went home. But Uncle Roy had sent some of the men out on the highway to see if he could tell just what was happening. And some went out to the Berrien Old Way, and some went out the other way. And in that day, there was just one old dirt road come through town. And they had taken dynamite with them out to, if the thing actually showed up, they would set this dynamite off to alert the folks at home in town. And after a while, this dynamite began to go off, and it was shattering to the nerves. We little realized what was actually taking place, or at least from my perspective, from us young fellows. It was very exciting and very, very sobering. We could tell by the seriousness of Uncle Roy and the brethren that this thing was a very, very serious problem. Well, the thing quieted down a little bit, and I laid down on the lawn in front of the schoolhouse because it was getting to be way into the night, 2 or 3 o'clock, as I recall. And all of a sudden, burst into the crowd came Dan Barlow, who had been out at the Berry Knoll. And this lineup of cars had come with their lights off from both ends of town, and they had come in and stopped. And I guess they were trying to decide what to do. But Joe Jessup and a fellow by the name of Charles Jensen, Chuck Knudsen, a bunch of them, and Dan Barlow were out this way of town, and probably many others. But Dan had crawled up to the side of the road where he could hear the officers talking. As soon as he felt like he could tell what they were doing, why, he slipped back away and run from the Berry Knoll to here through the sagebrush and the plowed field right down at the old schoolhouse. And he was just totally out of breath. He could hardly gasp out the words that said they were coming. They were coming in. And I had laid down there for a minute and fallen asleep. And when he burst into the crowd, and just at that time, over the hill came the screaming sirens and the red lights flashing till to describe it, I felt like all hell had broken loose.
Well, after hundreds of hours of planning, preparation, and secrecy, it was all for naught because the polygamists knew they were coming. Hours before lawmen arrived, in fact, a reporter drove into town and asked one of the FLDS community members, "Hey, has the raid happened yet?" Well, they didn't have to wait long for the answer because soon dynamite blasts awakened the community. And just like they planned, the leaders assembled at this historic schoolyard to await these government intruders. Now, I'm showing you some drone image I captured just a few days ago of that schoolhouse and the area, just to give you, again, a sense for the area. This little schoolhouse is not only historic, it's really a special place in the community because of this raid and the fact that so many images were taken in front of this school. It was a place where law enforcement processed children as they put them on buses and took them away and arrested adults. Now, I'm not sure if the overwhelming presence of the police led to an easy takedown or if the polygamists were truly as peaceful as they say they were. Either way, they didn't resist. And I'm sure those flashing lights, loud sirens, and overwhelming police presence was more than they could handle. Some say it was overkill in the compliant community. And the police reported that in less than 30 minutes, the entire community was secured. That's a pretty impressive feat. And given what we've learned over time about the stockpiling of weapons and explosives and other things, it may have been what prevented bloodshed. One reporter noted that the police action, in his opinion, was overkill and it was completely unnecessary. Now I'm going to add just a devil's advocate thought again, that it's possible that this overkill led to the police gaining quick control over the polygamists and likely avoided conflict, injuries, or even deaths. And I'm going to let you decide on which way that weighs. But within minutes, police started taking children into protective custody. Juvenile wives of adult polygamous men and their children were taken into what people believed was protective care. In all, it's believed that there were about 400 residents living in Short Creek at the time, and police arrested all of the adults except for a very few. Among those taken into protective custody were 263 kids, and this is always the saddest part of this. If you looked at Texas or at the Zion Society raid, the children were traumatized by being ripped from their parents. These kids didn't choose to be polygamists, and they didn't choose their parents, but they loved their parents. And it would actually take more than 2 years for at least 150 of those to finally be returned to their parents. But some parents never regained custody of their children. I appreciated the comments from that recording of Merrill Jessup many years later when he showed compassion on the police officers who were assigned to participate in the raid. We saw how emotionally disruptive that was for police officers in the Texas raid years later, and I can attest how hard it was on investigators in the Zion Society. Jessup didn't hold any ill will against the police, although it was clear that the community then and now still holds government leaders responsible for the raid. A raid that, in their opinion, accomplished very little. So let's hear Jessup talk about that portion of the raid.
The cars pulled up to the fence and stopped, and the officers jumped out and surrounded the group. Some of the outstanding things there was men like Grandpa Jessup. Of course, you have to realize all these officers armed with their guns out, and they didn't know what to expect. All they had heard is this was a bunch of wild desperados up here, and they were coming up to quail an insurrection against the state of Arizona. And I don't think they really knew what they were getting into, but they came prepared, as law officers have to do, to meet the issue or do whatever they had to do. So they were very, very jittery and very jumpy. And the press was there, and light bulbs flashing, and it was the old days where they had to spit out the light bulb and lick the other one to put it in real fast. And you could stomp on these light bulbs and they'd sound like a gun, which us kids delighted in doing after we calmed down a little bit, but it kept the officers kind of nerved up. But Grandpa Jessup said, if it's blood you want, take mine. And it was just, the air was so tingling with, I don't know, I can't find the words to describe the situation. And Uncle Roy repeated to them that the sand would drink our blood before we would give up our principles. And it was touching then, and it's touching to me now, and I'm sure to you. But I remember some of the other fellows. Spencer Johnson he looks like and is a mild-mannered fellow, but under those conditions, he could speak quite straight and forceful to those officers. And I would say he was like white hot. But anyway, as the morning wore on, we had the Sheriff Nyborg with all their lights and everything, pointing out who was who and what was what.
Well, in the beginning, Governor Pyle called the raid a monumentous police action against insurrection. Of the roughly 100 reporters that the governor had actually invited to witness the raid, most, though, had very negative responses about what happened there. One reporter editorialized the following. He said, quote, "By what stretch of the imagination could the actions of the Short Creek children be classified as insurrection? Were those teenagers that were playing volleyball in the schoolyard inspiring a rebellion? An insurrection? Well, if so, an insurrection was occurring with diapers and volleyballs," close quote. Now, I don't know if this was a political action or not, but Governor Pyle was actually up for election the following year, and he resoundingly lost. He blamed the fallout from his loss from the raid that destroyed, in his opinion, his political career. I want to pause just long enough to again invite you all to join me at CrimeCon in Nashville, Tennessee from May 31st through June 2nd. If you haven't been to CrimeCon, it is an amazing experience. I'm going to be presenting, and I'll also be there on Creators Row, so I'll look forward to chatting with you. Now, I've secured a special discount code if you decide to go and register. So when you're registering, and I'll put the links down below, just make sure that you enter the special code Profiling Evil. One word, Profiling Evil, and you'll get a great discount. And while you're there, we'll find some time to get all the Profiling Evil family members together and grab lunch or something on one of those days. Now, let's get back to this discussion. Shortly after Rulon Jeffs became the self-proclaimed prophet of the FLDS, again, this was 2002, a group of descendants of those families in that 1953 raid put up a monument outside of Cottonwood Park. Now, Jeffs demanded that this thing be taken down immediately, stating it was an offense to him and an offense to his God. Well, there was pushback from the families, but in the night, the monument was destroyed and the pieces were hidden away. Now, I'm going to come back to the raid in just a few minutes, but I wanted to share that little history lesson as Sam Zitting-Wyson from Growing Up in Polygamy and I drive around town. And we stopped here at Cottonwood Park. So let's watch the interactions that Sam and I had. And folks, please make sure you're going over to Sam and Melissa's YouTube channel called Growing Up in Polygamy. Check them out, and I hope you subscribe.
Hey, welcome back, everyone. Sam here with Growing Up in Polygamy.
Hey, and I'm Mike with Profiling Evil.
We found our way to Cottonwood Park, a very, very well-known park here in this area, and where I spent a lot of my time as a young boy, because this is where we held all of the community events when it was those days when we actually held events like the 4th of July and other harvest festivals and things like that.
You know, it's really interesting because I remember coming out during those major events hoping that I might see leaders that otherwise kept themselves hidden away, and I never could. Did the leaders come to those things? Or
They used to. And I know that we've mentioned Fred Jessup, who was the bishop here for many years. He was a big part of always being involved in the community events. And I know that Rulon Jeffs would come to those a lot back when he was alive. But when Warren Jeffs was in charge, those things started coming to an end. So I don't know if you were looking for leaders when Warren Jeffs was the prophet or before that.
Yeah, before. I was really, most of my time here was spent in the final days of Rulon's leadership and the beginning days of Warren.
Okay. So as soon as Warren started taking over, I don't think he was around. It was hard to find him.
Yeah, crazy. Well, we're going to just fly the drone around a little bit and look at some of the area while Sam tells us about the area.
All right. So you'll see right behind us is actually the train track. And this was, for me as a young boy, a big part of the park. You know, this train track would circle the park, and it was free rides all day long. As long as there was an event going on here, the train was running. Back in those days, it was a very different train. It was a very old train that I wonder to this day how it was actually working and running. But they've upgraded that, you can see now, to a much smaller and newer train that's hiding out there in the tunnel where they store it. That tunnel is where they used to store the older train too, but it was just a very different experience. But it's the same train track, and this was a great time as a young boy to just circle the park on the train.
All right, Cottonwood Park. Can you see up on the mountains there, the water tanks? That was a big water source for the houses here in Colorado and Hildale.
I did realize, and I guess my vision's just bad enough, I never really picked that out. I could see the flag.
Yeah,
Is there a flag?
On El Capitan up there behind the tree now, there is a flag up there, yes. There's this bridge here that we're passing. That is the bridge that goes over to the big slide, which we might catch a glimpse of. There's the slide right there to the left of the bridge. And that's the big slide that we always tried to find ways to go faster. We would throw sand on the slide. We would put paper plates to sit on. We always tried to make a way to go faster down that slide. But there it is. And this here is the bridge that goes over the creek from the zoo. So now we're on the other side of the zoo. into the park, and it looks like they have now added the train tracks to go that way.
When did that happen?
That must be new, because that was not there when I was a kid. All of this stuff here that's been here since Adam's day, Adam and Eve, is still here. See these old shacks right here? These, we would do fun things in those, like candle making and crafts and things like that. So when there were events going on, there was always something going on in those old buildings there.
Talk about a cottonwood tree.
Yeah, here's a visual. They're a lot more beautiful in the summertime when they're all green, but that is a very old tree, as you can tell, and was a fun one to play on.
Now you can catch Sam and Melissa's comments on this trip tomorrow on their show, so please make sure you check them out. But this is a great time to explain why I wanted to visit Cottonwood Park, while at the same time talking about the historic school building. Now again, I want to step back in time, but this time we're going back 21 years. Remember, 22 years earlier, Warren Jeffs became the prophet of the FLDS after his father Rulon died. The year was 2003, and the fundamentalist LDS church leader Warren Jeffs was furious because this monument had been erected. And I believe Jeffs was angry because people in the community were honoring somebody else rather than him. The monument was erected on the southeast side of Cottonwood Park, near the train tracks. And again, as we look at this aerial imagery from the drone, you can see the park in totality, and I'll kind of point out the area where the monument now stands. Plans were in place to turn that little white schoolhouse that we visited at the beginning of this video into a museum that was dedicated to the polygamist community, but most importantly to the polygamists who were jailed during that 1953 raid by Arizona police. But again, now in July of 2003, a group of ex-FLDS members put this monument in place to pay tribute to the survivors. Almost immediately, Warren Jeffs ordered that all FLDS faithful never return to Cottonwood Park again. He felt it was just an abhorrent thing that that monument was in the park. The park is owned by the UEP that was now under control of the state. But you know, just saying that wasn't enough for Jeffs. This self-proclaimed prophet then set in motion, in my opinion, the destruction of the monument, which had this little quote on it by one of the beloved members of the community, a guy who was known as Uncle Roy. The quote said, "We must never forget how the Lord blessed us in restoring our families taken in the 53 raid," close quote. Well, some people have speculated why the monument was destroyed, but this is something that's factual. The Deseret Morning News obtained a secretly recorded sermon that Warren Jeffs was giving when he claimed that God told him that the monument was an idolatory thing. It was an idol. In that sermon, Warren Jeffs said that God spoke to him and said, quote, "Verily, I say unto you, my servant Warren, my people have sinned a very grievous sin, in that they have raised up a monument to man and have not glorified me," close quote. Well, within days, the monument started being vandalized. At first, it was vandalized by somebody pouring tar all over the stone memorial. Then people started shooting paintballs to change it and to disfigure it. And then shortly after that, about 500 people were coming to the park to celebrate the Harvest Festival and discovered that the monument had been broken apart and buried. Well, this court-appointed fiduciary of the United Effort Plan, a guy named Bruce Wyson, said that some of the FLDS faithful were unhappy that the apostates were having a good time over at the park. He said that's what led to the destruction of the monument. And when the UEP went and complained to the Hildale Police Department, they walked away realizing, perhaps acknowledging or even remembering, that the FLDS-run police department at that time wasn't going to do a thing about solving that particular crime. So let's fast forward now to today. The park that Sam and I visited just a few days ago, the park that I flew this imagery over, is visited by polygamists and those who don't even believe in polygamy or the FLDS church or plural marriage anymore. That little train is now working again, and the monument has been rebuilt and prominently displayed in the park. This is another sign that changes are coming to Colorado City, Arizona, and Hildale, Utah, and another sign that Rulon Jeffs has failed in that once FLDS stronghold. And as Colorado City, Arizona, and Hildale, Utah change and become more normalized, members of the FLDS flee to other parts of the country to where they are creating new secret societies. And we'll talk about that in a future video. But next week, we're going to head eastward, just one block from Cottonwood Park, and look at the massive FLDS church meeting house. It's the place where Willie Jessup, the once bodyguard of Rulon Jeffs and Rulon Jeffs and even Johnson, slipped Rulon Jeffs through the grasping hands of the U.S. Marshal Service on the day he escaped, landing him on the FBI's most wanted list. You're not going to want to miss that discussion, so I hope you'll take time and subscribe to Profiling Evil. And make sure you're ringing the bell so you're getting all of our notifications. I hope that you're going to put your comments down below and that you'll take time to weigh in on each other's comments and feelings and emotions. Now, I wouldn't suggest being sweet. Remember, keep sweet. But be frank and share and be professional in the way that you share. Hey, please check out Profiling Evil on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. And if you like podcasts, folks, make sure you're subscribing to Profiling Evil's audio podcasts on your favorite podcast platform. This year, we've also put a lot of effort into choir practice, bringing it back at your request. Choir practice is on the first Monday of every single month, beginning at 8 p.m. Mountain Time.
Hey everybody, look who I'm hanging out with. And listen, I'm not attending choir practice, but I just wanted to tell you that you need to be watching Profiling Evil YouTube. Don't miss it. I'm telling you, there's something there for you every single time. I never miss, you shouldn't either.
I hope you don't mind me sharing that Dr. Phil clip, but it was so kind of him to make that and to encourage us all to join choir practice. I hope you will join too. Now, thanks for spending time with us. We'll see you soon at the next crime scene.